The Archival Recovery Division of the Georgia Historical Society in Savannah cataloged a peculiar entry in the autumn of 1912, a single folded leaf of paper that had survived against all statistical probability. The document was found inside a hollowed-out Bible that had been passed down through 3 generations of a family descended from the enslaved population of the Combahee River Basin. The paper itself was brittle, foxed with age, and the iron gall ink had faded to a dull brown. Yet the handwriting remained legible under proper magnification. It bore the date August 10th, 1855, and it contained precisely 6 signatures. Historians would later debate the authenticity of the artifact, with some arguing the vocabulary suggested a level of education uncommon among the enslaved population in that specific district, while others pointed to the distinctive legal phrasing of Colleton County as evidence of genuine provenance. Silas Jenkins, a freedman turned landowner, had uncovered the Bible during the demolition of a condemned cabin on the outskirts of the old Cypress Knoll property. He had purchased the land for back taxes in 1878, seeking to farm the rich soil that had once been worked by his ancestors. While pulling rotted floorboards from the main residence, his shovel struck a metal strongbox wrapped in oilcloth. Inside lay the family Bible, its pages fused together by humidity and time. It was not the scripture that halted his work, but the thin sheet of paper tucked between the Old and New Testaments. He recognized the name of the plantation immediately, a place that had haunted the local folklore for decades. The paper did not tell a story of spiritual redemption, but rather a precise accounting of a crime. The text on the document was short, devoid of the flowery language characteristic of the period's white literary elite. It read like a ledger entry, stark and accusatory. It named Elias Thorne as the architect of a death and Isaiah as the victim. The script varied between the signatories, with some writing in a practiced cursive and others marking with a simple X, witnessed by a second party. This variance in literacy suggested a secret network of education operating within the confines of the plantation, a direct violation of the slave codes of South Carolina. The existence of such a document implied a concerted effort to preserve truth in an environment designed to obliterate it, a hidden archive maintained by those who had no legal right to their own history. Elias Thorne had established Cypress Knoll on 1,200 acres of marshland near the Combahee River, a region known for the intense labor required to cultivate rice in the tidal floods. By 1855, the estate was a marvel of agricultural efficiency, producing crops that filled the holds of ships bound for European markets. The main house was a structure of tabby and clapboard, raised on brick pilings to escape the damp heat, featuring a wide piazza that overlooked the endless green of the rice fields. Thorne was a man of significant standing in the district, a magistrate who adjudicated disputes among his neighbors with a reputation for cold impartiality. He owned 64 human beings, a number that placed him firmly within the planter class, though he lacked the ancient pedigree of the Charleston aristocracy. The economic foundation of Cypress Knoll rested not merely on the quantity of its labor force, but on the specialized skills of a few individuals. Isaiah, a carpenter in his early 20s, represented the highest tier of this human capital. He had been trained by a master craftsman brought from Charleston and had since become indispensable to the maintenance of the estate's infrastructure. Thorne's personal ledger from 1854 valued Isaiah at $2,200, a figure that reflected not just his ability to hew timber, but his capacity to design intricate millwork. This valuation placed a target on his back, turning his every movement into a calculation of risk and asset management. He was a tool of immense value, and like all expensive tools, he was both essential and replaceable. Isaiah's mother, Hagar, worked in the laundry house, a position that allowed her a panoramic view of the domestic rhythms of the big house. She was a woman who had survived the sale of her own husband years prior, learning to navigate the brutal silences of the plantation with a stoicism that her son had not fully inherited. The laundry was a place of gathering, where the soiled linens of the White family revealed secrets that were never spoken aloud in the parlor. In the spring of 1855, Hagar began to notice shifts in the daily routine that pricked her instincts. The delivery of linens to the study was happening at odd hours, and the silence that followed was too studied, too deliberate to be mere idleness. The study itself was a room Isaiah had renovated over the course of 3 months, installing shelves of heart pine and a wide desk where Elias Thorne could review his correspondence. It was a space of masculine authority, filled with the smell of tobacco and old paper. Yet it had become the unlikely setting for a dangerous convergence. Eleanor Thorne, the magistrate's daughter, had taken an undue interest in the construction process. She was a young woman of 19, possessed of an intellect that chafed against the strictures placed upon her gender, often found reading her father's newspapers or studying the maps that lined the walls. Her interest in Isaiah's craft had initially seemed academic, an inquiry into joinery and construction, but the frequency of her visits had long since passed the boundary of propriety. Eleanor's presence in the study during those late afternoons was noted by the house staff, particularly by Josiah, the butler, whose survival depended on seeing everything and saying nothing. He observed Eleanor watching Isaiah's hands as he planed a board, her gaze lingering not on the shavings falling to the floor, but on the movement of his muscles. This attention was a distinct species of danger, one that the enslaved community recognized with a visceral fear. There was no safety in the affections of a white woman. Such affection was a weapon that fired backward, killing the object of desire first. Yet, for Isaiah, the danger had become a trap he could not spring without catastrophic consequences. The timeline of the catastrophe remains fixed in the archival record through the precise dating on the hidden document, but the oral histories of the Combahee region fill in the sensory details of the summer heat. August of 1855 was unrelentingly hot, with humidity so thick it blurred the horizon where the river met the sky. The mosquitoes were ferocious, carrying fevers that weakened the constitution and frayed the nerves of the planter class. It was in this atmosphere of suffocation and tension that the boundary between the study and the private world of the Thorne family dissolved. The silence that Hagar had feared finally broke, not with a shout, but with the turning of a brass door handle in the dark of night. Elias Thorne was a light sleeper, a habit honed by years of anxiety regarding his property and his position. On the night of August 9th, a sound from the floor below disturbed his rest, a creak of timber that sounded heavier than the settling of an old house. He rose, lit a lamp, and took his rifle from the rack, not out of fear of an intruder, but out of a reflexive need to assert dominion over his domain. He moved through the hallway with the quiet precision of a hunter, descending the stairs to the study. The door was ajar, a violation of the order he maintained with religious fervor. What he saw when he pushed the door open required no interpretation, no legal parsing of statutes or intent. The scene was a tableau of absolute transgression, illuminated by the low burn of a lamp on the desk. Eleanor was seated on the floor, her nightclothes disheveled, and Isaiah stood near the window, caught in the act of fleeing. The rifle in Thorne's hands did not rise immediately. Instead, his mind performed the calculation that would define the next 24 hours. He saw his daughter, his property, and his reputation colliding in a single, ruinous moment. The silence in the room stretched thin, vibrating with the potential for violence. The standoff lasted only a few seconds, before Thorne spoke, his voice low and controlled, ordering Eleanor to her room and Isaiah to remain still. There was no rage in his command, only the terrifying clarity of a man managing a crisis of capital. He did not strike his daughter, nor did he immediately fire upon the carpenter. The economic loss of $2,200 stayed his hand, redirecting his impulse toward a more bureaucratic cruelty. He locked the study door from the outside, trapping Isaiah inside until he could summon the necessary assistance, and turned the key with a sound that echoed like a gavel striking a bench. The discovery of the affair was the spark that ignited the powder keg of Cypress Knoll, setting in motion a chain of events that would leave the plantation in ruins within a decade. Thorne's reaction to the violation was not driven by the protection of his child, but by the preservation of his social standing. He recognized that the destruction of Isaiah was inevitable, but the manner of that destruction required careful choreography to avoid scandal. As he returned to his bedroom to wake his wife in dress, the fate of the carpenter was already sealed, written in the invisible ledger of Southern honor that valued image above all else. The night was no longer a time for sleep, but for the administration of a terrible justice. Elias Thorne dressed in the dark, his movements deliberate as he selected a coat appropriate for the business of the night. He did not wake his wife Martha, but instead went directly to the quarters behind the main house to summon Josiah, the butler, and 2 field hands who served as the plantation's enforcement. His instructions were delivered in a whisper that carried the weight of absolute law. They were to retrieve chains from the smokehouse and proceed to the study, where they would secure the prisoner. The economic reality of the situation dictated every action. A valuable asset had been compromised, and the logistics of containment required immediate attention before the son could expose the scandal to the rest of the household. Isaiah offered no resistance when the door was unlocked and the 3 men entered the study. He stood motionless by the window, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender that was both pragmatic and hopeless. The heavy iron chains were wrapped around his wrists and ankles, the metal biting into the skin he had carefully washed just hours before. Josiah avoided meeting the carpenter's eyes, focusing instead on the mechanism of the padlock. To look at Isaiah would be to acknowledge the humanity that Thorne was systematically stripping away, a recognition that Josiah could not afford if he wished to survive the night himself. The procession to the root cellar was conducted in silence, the only sound being the clinking of iron and the crunch of gravel underfoot. Thorne led the way with a lantern, his back straight, projecting the same authority he used when presiding over the magistrate's court. The cellar was a damp hole carved into the earth behind the kitchen, originally designed to store root vegetables through the winter, but now repurposed as a dungeon for those who breached the plantation's rigid code. Isaiah was forced down the wooden steps into the darkness. The trapdoor slammed shut above him, sealing him in a blackness that smelled of mildew and old potatoes. Once the prisoner was secured, Thorne turned his attention to the domestic front, walking up the main staircase to the bedroom where Eleanor had retreated. He found her sitting on the edge of her bed, still wearing the rumpled nightgown, her face pale in the candlelight. She did not plead for mercy or attempt to explain her actions. The set of her father's jaw told her that such efforts would be futile. Thorne did not strike her, reserving his violence for the legal and social realms where he excelled. He simply informed her that she was confined to her chambers and that her future would be decided by the needs of the family, not her own desires. Martha Thorne emerged from the master bedroom as the conversation ended, her presence a study in repressed horror. She had been awake during the entire episode, listening to the heavy footsteps and the clank of chains, piecing together the catastrophe through the thin floorboards. She looked at her daughter, not with maternal concern, but with the calculation of a woman who understood the fragility of social standing. The silence between mother and daughter was heavier than any accusation. It was an agreement to prioritize the family's reputation over the truth of what had transpired in the study. Martha returned to her room without a word, closing the door on the tragedy. The household staff, particularly Hagar, were already awake and watching from the shadows of the back porch. News of Isaiah's capture had traveled through the slave quarters with a speed that defied the distance, a silent communication network that required no words. Hagar stood by the laundry house, her hands submerged in cold water, staring at the main house where the lamps still burned. She knew that the next few hours would determine whether her son lived or died, and she also knew that her own power in this situation was non-existent. The waiting was a torture, distinct from the physical pain Isaiah was enduring in the cellar. Thorne did not sleep for the remainder of the night. He sat at the very desk where the transgression had occurred, pulling a fresh sheet of paper from the drawer to draft a letter to a colleague in Savannah. In his mind, the event was already being restructured into a narrative that would protect the Thorne name. He could not write the truth. Instead, he constructed a fiction of theft and insolence, a story that would justify the harsh punishment he was planning without implicating his daughter. The lie was a mortar that would build the wall between the family and the scandal, a construction of deceit as solid as the plantation house itself. By dawn, the atmosphere at Cypress Knoll had shifted from the panic of the night to a grim preparation for the day's business. Thorne ordered the entire enslaved population to assemble in the yard between the house and the quarters. This was not an unusual occurrence. The community was often gathered for roll call or distribution of rations. However, the mood that morning was charged with a specific tension. The absence of Isaiah from the lineup was a void that everyone felt, a missing piece in the puzzle of their daily lives. They stood in rows, waiting to hear what new violence the master would enact. Isaiah was dragged from the cellar, his body stiff from the cold floor and the tight restraints. He blinked against the harsh morning light, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found his mother. Hagar stood near the back, her face a mask of stone, offering him no outward signal of grief, but anchoring him with her presence. Thorne stood on the piazza, looking down at his property with the detached expression of a judge passing sentence. He announced that a crime had been committed, though he did not specify the nature of the crime, leaving the assembled workers to fill in the blanks with the rumors that had already circulated. The punishment was administered with a terrifying efficiency. Thorne did not delegate this task to an overseer. He took the strap from the hook on the wall, choosing to deliver the 20 lashes himself. This was a statement of personal violation, a reassertion of ownership over a tool that had malfunctioned. Isaiah was tied to the post used for drying tobacco, his shirt stripped away. The sound of the leather striking flesh was wet and heavy, echoing across the silent yard. Eleanor watched from her bedroom window, forced by her mother's grip on her shoulder to witness the consequences of her actions. The flogging lasted 15 minutes, though to those watching, it felt like hours. Isaiah did not cry out, a small defiance that seemed to enrage Thorne further. When it was over, the carpenter was cut down and left lying in the dirt while Thorne retired to wash his hands. The spectacle served its purpose. It terrorized the population into silence and physically broke the man who had dared to cross the invisible line. The wounds on Isaiah's back were deep, requiring medical attention that Thorne would not provide, leaving him to heal or fester in the chains of the cellar. As the crowd dispersed, returning to their duties with the mechanical motions of the traumatized, Hagar broke protocol. She rushed to her son, kneeling in the dirt to check his breathing before the guards could pull her away. In that brief moment, she whispered a promise to him, a vow that his story would not end in silence. She was shoved back by a field hand, acting on orders, but the fire in her eyes could not be extinguished. The physical violence was over, but the recording of the event had just begun in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The immediate brutality of the morning was merely the prelude to a more enduring form of violence, the bureaucratic erasure of the truth. Thorne returned to his study, his hands still pink from the scrubbing, and began to construct the legal framework necessary to dispose of Isaiah without triggering an inquiry. He drafted a bill of sale that listed the carpenter not as a skilled craftsman, but as a field hand prone to insolence, intentionally devaluing the asset to justify a quick transaction. This falsified document was designed to create a paper trail that would satisfy any curious parties in the district, framing the sale as a routine culling of a disruptive element rather than the concealment of a family scandal. Dr. Henry Langston arrived at Cypress Knoll by mid-morning, summoned by a note that had ridden by horseback to his estate 5 miles upriver. He was a man of science who had long since traded his moral compass for the privileges of the planter class, his medical practice serving as a thin veneer for the economic interests he shared with men like Thorne. He was led to Eleanor's room, where he conducted a physical examination under the watchful gaze of Martha Thorne. The doctor's task was not to heal, but to document. He needed to establish a baseline of virginity, lost or preserved, to determine the legal severity of the crime committed against the Thorne estate. Langston's report, penned in the neat script of a professional, would later be cited as evidence of the precarious nature of Southern honor. He noted in his private ledger that the examination revealed clear evidence of repeated sexual activity, a diagnosis that sealed Eleanor's fate as effectively as it did Isaiah's. There could be no claim of assault or coercion to save the family reputation. The interaction was ongoing and consensual in the eyes of the law, a far greater sin in the rigid social hierarchy of the South. Thorne paid the doctor $20 in gold coin for his discretion, a transaction that transformed a medical assessment into a financial pact of silence. Eleanor sat motionless on the edge of her bed after the examination, the clinical nature of the intrusion numbing her more effectively than any physical blow. Her mother stood by the window, refusing to look at her daughter, treating the silence in the room as a vacuum that must not be filled with excuses. Martha finally spoke, her voice devoid of warmth, instructing Eleanor to pack a single trunk. The plan was already forming. Eleanor would be sent to Savannah to live with her aunt, a spinster named Maud, who had long since fallen from the graces of high society. This exile was not a punishment, but a strategic retreat to allow the rumors to fade. The confrontation between father and daughter occurred in the hallway outside the study, a space that had once been Isaiah's domain of craftsmanship. Thorne stood with his back to the light, his face obscured by the shadow of his own authority. He did not ask for her side of the story. He offered only a lecture on the economics of their reality. He informed her that her romanticism had cost him a valuable asset and the family its standing, and that the only way to repair the breach was to remove the stain entirely. Eleanor's protests regarding her feelings for Isaiah were cut short with a look of such cold disdain that she felt her throat close around the words. Thorne's handling of the sale of Isaiah was a study in calculated cruelty. He rejected an initial offer from a rice planter in Georgetown who sought a skilled worker, realizing that keeping Isaiah in the Low Country risked the carpenter encountering someone who knew the truth. Instead, Thorne entered into correspondence with a trader named Silas Gant, a man whose operations in the Pine Barrens of Georgia were notorious for their lethality. Gant specialized in acquiring damaged or troublesome slaves at a discount and working them to death in the turpentine camps, a fate considered a death sentence by the enslaved community. Gant arrived at Cypress Knoll on the evening of August 10th, his wagon rattling up the drive like a hearse. He inspected Isaiah in the cellar, noting the lash wounds with the dispassionate eye of a butcher examining a side of beef. The haggling was brief and brutal. Thorne accepted a price of $900, a sum that represented a staggering loss of over half the carpenter's value, but one that purchased the certainty of silence. The transaction was recorded in the plantation ledger as the sale of a field hand, unsound, a final lie that stripped Isaiah of his skill and his history. While the white patriarchs conducted their business in the shadows, the enslaved community was engaged in a different form of documentation. Hagar, unable to write, but possessed of a formidable memory, sought out Pearl, the kitchen cook who had secretly learned to read and write from a previous master's children. They met in the relative safety of the pantry, the heavy aroma of dried herbs masking their whispered conversation. Hagar dictated a statement that would serve as a counter-narrative to Thorne's ledger, a refusal to let the official record stand as the only truth of what happened at Cypress Knoll. Pearl transcribed the words onto a scrap of paper she had salvaged from the rubbish, the ink she used stolen from the master's desk during the chaos of the morning. The text was simple and direct, naming Isaiah as the victim and Eleanor as the architect of his destruction, though it noted the ultimate blame lay with the system that bound them all. The document was dated August 10th, 1855, and included space for signatures. This act of writing was a rebellion far more dangerous than a physical escape, for it challenged the master's control over history itself. 6 members of the enslaved community signed the document that night, each using the name given to them by their mothers or the one they carried in secret. Hagar made her mark, an X, that carried the weight of her entire lineage. Others signed their names with a trembling but determined hand, including Josiah, the butler, whose compliance earlier that day had been a necessary mask. This coalition of witnesses transformed the paper into a testament, a beacon of truth hidden in the dark. The risk they took was immense. Discovery would have meant whippings, sale, or death. The paper was sealed with wax dripped from a tallow candle and placed inside a hollowed-out section of the study's baseboard, a spot Isaiah had repaired years ago, and left loose specifically for the purpose of hiding valuables. It was an irony that the master's own study, the seat of his power, would house the evidence of his crime. The board was replaced with such precision that no one walking by would ever suspect the wall contained a voice. The hiding place was secure, intended to wait for a future time when such a document could be brought into the light. As dawn broke over the Combahee River, Gant's wagon was prepared for departure. Isaiah was pulled from the cellar, his body broken and his spirit dimmed by the certainty of his fate. He was loaded into the back of the wagon like timber, chained hand and foot to prevent any desperate leap for freedom. Hagar stood at the edge of the yard, held back by the unspoken rules of the plantation, watching her son disappear down the oak-lined drive. She did not scream or wail. Her grief was a quiet, devastating weight that settled over the plantation like the morning fog, a heavy blanket of sorrow that smothered the songs of the workers. Eleanor watched from her window, her own trunk packed and waiting by the door. She saw Isaiah's face as the wagon turned toward the main road, a fleeting glimpse of the man she had claimed to love. The reality of her powerlessness and the destructive capability of her privilege finally crystallized in her mind. She had ignited a fire that consumed him and left her with nothing but ashes. The wagon rolled out of sight, taking the carpenter toward the pine barrens and a swift, brutal death, leaving Eleanor to face the long, silent years of her own confinement in Savannah. The departure of Eleanor Thorne from Cypress Knoll occurred with a silence that was as absolute as a funeral procession. On the morning of August 12, 1855, a carriage arrived from Charleston to transport her to Savannah, a vehicle that felt less like transportation and more like a mobile prison cell. She carried with her only a single trunk of belongings, a collection of books and dresses that seemed to belong to a stranger. Her mother, Martha, watched from the piazza, her hands folded tightly at her waist, refusing to offer a parting embrace or a word of comfort. The severance was surgical. The family was excising the tumor of scandal before it could metastasize through their social circles. Elias Thorne did not witness his daughter's exit. He had retreated to his study, preferring the company of his ledgers to the messy reality of his family's disintegration. He had effectively washed his hands of Eleanor, viewing her now as a liability to be managed rather than a child to be raised. The driver of the carriage, a hired man who knew better than to ask questions, kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead as Eleanor climbed inside. The wheels crunched over the gravel, a sound that signaled the end of her life as a privileged planter's daughter and the beginning of her existence as a hidden shame. The journey to Savannah took 2 days by road, a passage through a landscape that felt increasingly alien to Eleanor. The lush rice fields gave way to the darker, thicker swamps of the coastal plain, the Spanish moss hanging like ragged curtains from the ancient oaks. She found no solace in the scenery, seeing instead the vast, indifferent machinery of the world that had crushed Isaiah. Every mile marker was a betrayal, a physical separation, not just from her home but from the site of her crime. She remained rigid on the bench seat, her jaw clenched against the tears that she refused to shed, determined not to give her grief the satisfaction of release. Arriving in Savannah, the carriage navigated the crowded cobblestone streets of the commercial district before turning into the quieter, shadowed lanes of the residential district. The city was a different world, a bustling port where the horrors of the trade were masked by the elegance of the architecture and the ceaseless hum of commerce. They stopped before a narrow brick townhouse on Jones Street, the residence of Aunt Maud. The house was squeezed between two larger, grander structures, a physical manifestation of its occupants' marginal status in society. It was here that Eleanor would serve her sentence of invisibility. Maud Thorne was a woman in her late 50s, a widow whose husband had left her with a respectable address but insufficient funds, forcing her to rely on the charity of relatives. She greeted Eleanor at the door with an air of professional detachment, treating her niece less as family and more as a boarder with a problematic history. The arrangement was strictly transactional. Elias Thorne had agreed to send a monthly stipend to cover Eleanor's expenses, purchasing Maud's silence and cooperation. On the third floor, a small dormered space that looked out over the back garden rather than the street, ensuring her isolation. It was a clean, sparse chamber, stripped of the luxuries she had grown up with, designed to facilitate reflection and penance. Maud laid out the rules immediately. Eleanor was not to receive callers, she was not to attend social functions, and she was to assist with the household accounts to earn her keep. Her existence in Savannah was to be a whisper, a rumor of a sick relative convalescing in the country, nothing more. Meanwhile, in the Pine Barrens of Georgia, Isaiah was entering the final circle of his torment. Silas Gant's turpentine operation was a sprawling, lawless expanse of cleared forest and makeshift camps where the air was thick with the biting flies and the sharp scent of resin. The work, known as boxing, involved slashing the bark of living pine trees to collect the sticky sap that would be distilled into turpentine. It was labor that destroyed the lungs and the back, performed under a sun that showed no mercy. Isaiah, his wounds still raw from the flogging, was put to work immediately, his carpentry skills entirely irrelevant to the brutal demands of the harvest. The regime at the turpentine camp was designed to extract maximum labor for minimum cost, and the life expectancy of a worker in such conditions was measured in months rather than years. Gant had purchased Isaiah at a discount precisely because he expected the man to fail, calculating that he could extract enough work to turn a profit before the carpenter succumbed to exhaustion or disease. There was no doctor, no respite, and little food. Isaiah worked in chains, the iron rubbing his ankles raw, a constant reminder that his value had depreciated to the point where his life was cheaper than the metal that bound him. The isolation of the camp was profound. Isaiah was surrounded by other men who had been discarded by the plantation system, runaways caught and resold, incorrigibles, and the broken remnants of families. They communicated in grunts and guarded whispers, wary of the overseers who carried whips and pistols. Isaiah's silence, once a shield of dignity, became a hollow void. He thought of the study he had built, the shelves that would hold the ledgers of his destruction, and the woman whose curiosity had cost him his life. The irony was a bitter pill that he swallowed with the gritty cornbread provided for supper. Back in Savannah, Eleanor attempted to navigate the suffocating quiet of her new life. She was desperate for news of Isaiah, but the channels of communication available to a woman in her position were entirely controlled by men who wished to keep her ignorant. She scanned the newspapers that Maud left in the parlor, searching for any mention of a sale or a death, but the print offered only stock prices and political rhetoric. The disconnect between her internal turmoil and the mundane continuation of the world outside her window was a torture of a different kind, a psychological strain that frayed her nerves. The reality of her powerlessness was brought home in a letter from her father that arrived 2 weeks into her exile. The note was brief and cruel, informing her that the carpenter situation had been resolved to his satisfaction, and that she was never to speak the name of Cypress Knoll again in correspondence. He did not mention Isaiah by name, referring to him only as the property, a linguistic erasure that sought to annihilate the human element of the tragedy. Eleanor held the paper over the candle flame in her room, watching the words curl and blacken, the only response she could offer to his authority. December of 1855 brought a biting cold to the Georgia swamps, a damp chill that settled into the bones of the men working the turpentine stills. Isaiah, weakened by dysentery and the cumulative effects of the physical labor, collapsed while carrying a heavy load of resin. The overseer, a man named Guthrie, did not bother to summon medical aid. Isaiah was dragged to the edge of the camp and left in a crude shelter to recover or die, his fate considered inconsequential to the day's production quotas. The indifference of the universe to his suffering was total, a final confirmation that the system viewed him as disposable biomass. The official record of Isaiah's death is sparse, a single line in Gant's accounting book dated December 14, 1855. It noted the loss of an asset valued at $900, a tax write-off against the year's profits. There was no grave marker, no ceremony, and no notification of next of kin. His body was likely buried in an unmarked pit in the sandy soil, swallowed by the forest he had been forced to work. The silence that followed was absolute, a void where a human life had once existed, erased as efficiently as a mistake in a ledger entry. The news of Isaiah's death traveled through the underground networks of the enslaved South, moving with a speed and reliability that defied the lack of official channels. It took nearly 10 weeks for the word to reach the Combahee River Basin, carried by a freedman who worked the riverboats and traded information along with goods. He found Hagar in the laundry house on a cold February morning in 1856, delivering the message in a low murmur while she sorted a pile of white linens. She absorbed the news without breaking her rhythm, her hands continuing to fold a sheet, a lifetime of enforced stoicism masking the collapse of her interior world. The Grapevine Telegraph, as this informal intelligence network was known, provided details that the official records suppressed. Hagar learned not just of the date of death, but of the conditions, the dysentery, the collapse, the unmarked grave in the sandy soil. This knowledge was a heavy burden, but it was also a form of power, a truth that the Thorne family could not touch. She did not weep in front of the messenger. Instead, she thanked him with a nod and continued her work, knowing that any display of grief would be reported back to the big house as insubordination or insolence. That evening, after the work bell had rung and the overseers had retired, Hagar gathered with a small circle of women in the privacy of her cabin. She finally allowed herself to mourn, her voice rising in a low, keening melody that was older than the plantation itself. It was a spiritual of mourning, a sound that carried across the quarters and settled over the roofs like a heavy fog. The other residents of the slave street understood the language of her grief. They knew that Isaiah was gone and that the master's justice had claimed another victim. The sound was a collective wound, a shared acknowledgement of the fragility of their existence. Eleanor, trapped in the genteel silence of the Savannah townhouse, remained ignorant of Isaiah's fate for over a month. Her isolation was compounded by the strict control her aunt exerted over the mail, ensuring that any communication from Cypress Knoll was vetted before it reached her hands. It was only in late March that a letter arrived from her mother, Martha, a document filled with the mundane details of plantation life, the weather, the health of the livestock, the social calendar of the neighbors. Near the bottom of the second page, sandwiched between a complaint about the cook and a note on the price of indigo, was a single, chilling sentence. "The carpenter died in Georgia. Your father considers the matter closed." The impact of those words on Eleanor was physical. A sudden sharp contraction in her chest that left her gasping for air. She read the sentence 3 times, the handwriting blurring as her eyes filled with tears. The sterile, detached tone of her mother's account stood in stark contrast to the vibrant reality of the man she had known, the craftsman who had shaped wood with such care, the man whose laughter had once filled the study. The realization that he was gone, buried in an unmarked grave hundreds of miles from his home, shattered the fragile shell of denial she had constructed around herself. She retreated to her small room on the 3rd floor, locking the door against the intrusion of her aunt's curiosity. There, in the dim light of the afternoon, she finally allowed herself to confront the magnitude of her complicity. She realized then that her love had been a luxury purchased with his life, a currency that she had spent without understanding its cost. The guilt was no longer an abstract concept or a theological notion. It was a tangible weight, a stone in her stomach that would not dissolve. She collapsed onto the narrow bed, her body shaking with sobs that she had suppressed since the night of the discovery. Aunt Maud, hearing the commotion from the hallway, knocked once before entering with a tray of tea. She found her niece in a state of utter desolation, clutching the letter as if it were a lifeline. Maud was not a woman given to sentimentality, but she recognized the sound of a breaking point. She placed the tray on the dresser and stood by the window, offering no comfort, but also no judgment. She simply waited for the storm to pass, understanding that this moment was the inevitable reckoning of a girl who had played with forces she did not comprehend. The conversation that followed was brutal in its clarity. Eleanor confessed the truth of the relationship, speaking the name Isaiah aloud for the first time in months. Maud listened without interrupting, her face a mask of pragmatic resignation. When Eleanor finished, gasping for air, Her aunt delivered a diagnosis that was more cutting than any reproach. She informed Eleanor that while she had not wielded the whip or signed the bill of sale, her privilege had made her an agent of the system. "You were the spark," Maud said quietly, "and the house was made of tinder. You cannot claim innocence simply because you did not wish for the fire." This assessment lodged in Eleanor's mind like a splinter, a painful truth that she could not extract. She realized that her exile in Savannah was not merely a punishment for a social transgression, but a necessary hiding place for a woman who had caused a death. She began to see the city differently, no longer as a prison, but as a vantage point from which to observe the machinery of the world that had destroyed Isaiah. The bustling streets, the ships in the harbor, the constant movement of goods and people, all of it was underpinned by the same brutal economics that had valued Isaiah at $900 in his final days. Eleanor's grief began to transmute into a cold, hard resolve. She knew that she could not bring Isaiah back, nor could she easily atone for the specific wrong she had committed. However, she could refuse to let his death be meaningless. She began to pay attention to the conversations in the parlors and the marketplaces, listening for the coded language of abolition and dissent that existed even in the heart of Savannah. She was looking for a way to channel her guilt into action, to transform her paralysis into a weapon against the system that had used her as its instrument. The necessity of action became even clearer as the nation drifted closer to the abyss of civil war. The political tensions that had long simmered beneath the surface of American life were boiling over with the raid on Harper's Ferry and the election of 1860 sending shockwaves through the South. Eleanor watched the men of Savannah drill in the squares, their faces filled with a martial fervor that she found repellent. She understood that the conflict to come would be fought over the bodies of men like Isaiah, and she determined that she would not sit idly by as a genteel spinster while the world burned. She sought out a contact she had overheard mentioned in hushed tones at the market, a Quaker woman named Abigail who operated a small lending library on the edge of the city. This initial contact was tentative, a testing of the waters, but it marked a definitive step away from the passivity that had characterized her life at Cypress Knoll. Eleanor was no longer a girl guided by romantic notions. She was a woman possessed by a need for redemption, willing to risk the safety of her exile for the sake of a higher duty. The transition from grieving lover to active conspirator was not instantaneous, but the foundation was laid in those months of sorrow. Eleanor began to educate herself on the logistics of the Underground Railroad, learning the routes and the signals that guided fugitives north. She used her skills at bookkeeping to manage funds for the cause, hiding the transactions in her aunt's household accounts. The same mind that had once been wasted on watercolors and social visits was now sharpened by the urgency of resistance. The ghost of Isaiah had become her compass, guiding her toward a dangerous and uncertain future. The meeting with Abigail, the Quaker woman who operated the lending library, took place in a cramped back room that smelled of dust and aging paper. Eleanor, dressed in the drab colors of a penitent, stated her desire to help the cause, expecting gratitude or at least direction. Instead, Abigail fixed her with a stare that was devoid of sentimentality. The older woman did not offer solace. She offered an indictment. She asked Eleanor if her desire to help was born of a genuine commitment to justice or merely a desperate need to salve her own conscience. The question struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow, stripping away the romantic veneer of her self-appointed martyrdom. Abigail continued her interrogation, pressing Eleanor on the specifics of her relationship with Isaiah. She asked if the carpenter had ever truly possessed the freedom to refuse a white woman's advances, or if his compliance had been a survival strategy masquerading as consent. The distinction was crucial and painful. forcing Eleanor to confront the uncomfortable reality that her love might have been an exertion of power rather than a meeting of equals. Eleanor left the library that day not with an assignment, but with a crushing sense of her own naivety. Her guilt reshaped into a sharper, more agonizing form. Despite the harsh introduction, Eleanor persisted. She returned to the library week after week, proving her worth through menial tasks and a willingness to listen. Her background as a planter's daughter, once a source of shame, became a tactical asset. She knew the schedules of the patrols, the geography of the rice fields, and the specific language used to document property. By the winter of 1857, she had transitioned from a novice to a reliable node in the underground network. Her penance expressed through the quiet accumulation of intelligence. The work was clandestine by necessity, requiring a level of deception that would have scandalized her mother. Eleanor used her idle hours to forge passes and travel permits, replicating the handwriting of local magistrates with a precision that terrified even her. She learned to encode messages within seemingly innocuous letters to cousins in the North, using a cipher based on a book of poetry she kept hidden in her trunk. Each successful forgery was a small rebellion against the system that had murdered Isaiah, a reclamation of the skills she had once used to maintain the Thorne family accounts. Her activities were not without risk. The city of Savannah was rife with spies and informants, eager to collect rewards for reporting disloyalty. Eleanor learned to navigate the streets with a practiced air of benign vacancy, playing the role of the dull, pious spinster to perfection. She carried contraband documents inside bolts of fabric purchased from the market, her heart racing beneath a calm exterior every time she passed a uniformed officer. The constant low-level fear became a familiar companion, a stimulant that replaced the lethargy of her earlier grief. While Eleanor built her new life in the shadows, the political climate of the South grew increasingly volatile. The election of Abraham Lincoln in November of 1860 sent shockwaves through the social fabric of Savannah. Eleanor watched from her window as the city erupted in a frenzy of secessionist fervor, torchlight parades illuminating the night sky with the promise of war. The rhetoric of liberty and independence rang hollow in her ears, a grotesque parody of the freedom she was secretly trying to facilitate for others. The firing on Fort Sumter in April of 1861 transformed the abstract threat of conflict into a concrete reality. Eleanor stood on the rooftop of the townhouse, watching the distant horizon where the bombardment of Pulaski had begun, the heavy thud of cannon signaling the end of the world she had known. Aunt Maud joined her, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. The older woman commented on the folly of men, but Eleanor saw the conflict as a necessary purgation, a fire that might finally burn away the rot of the institution that had claimed Isaiah. With the onset of war, the nature of Eleanor's work shifted. The Underground Railroad's focus moved from assisting individuals to gathering intelligence that could aid the federal blockade. Eleanor's detailed knowledge of the coastal waterways and plantation layouts became valuable military assets. She began to document the movements of Confederate supplies, noting the arrival of trains and the loading of ships, passing this information through a chain of contacts that eventually reached the Union Navy. She was no longer just a forger. She had become a spy. Aunt Maud passed away quietly in March of 1862. Succumbing to a fever that had weakened her for months. Eleanor inherited the house on Jones Street and the modest independence that came with it. While she mourned the woman who had sheltered her, the inheritance removed the need for subterfuge regarding her movements. She now had the authority to manage the household as she saw fit, turning the townhouse into a discreet hub for the Unionist cause in the heart of the Confederacy. The war years brought a new kind of tension to Eleanor's life. The city was gripped by shortages and blockades, the shelves of the merchants emptying as the conflict dragged on. Yet, Eleanor thrived in the austerity. She had little use for the luxuries that had once defined her class. She sold her jewelry to fund the procurement of medical supplies for wounded soldiers and runaway slaves, stripping herself of the last trappings of her former identity. The planter's daughter was slowly disappearing, replaced by a woman who existed solely for the work. By 1863, Eleanor was deeply embedded in the espionage network that operated out of occupied Beaufort. She coordinated the movement of information between the coastal islands and the Union fleet, a dangerous game that required her to travel under the guise of charitable visits to wounded relatives. The risk of exposure was constant. A careless word or a suspicious neighbor could have led to her arrest and execution for treason. Yet, she moved through the chaos of the war with a sense of purpose that anchored her, her actions finally aligning with her conscience. The fall of Savannah to General Sherman in December of 1864 brought the war to her doorstep. Eleanor watched the blue-clad troops march into the city, the shackles of the Confederacy falling away with each passing regiment. The sight should have brought her joy, a validation of her years of work. However, the victory was tinged with a profound melancholy. The Union had prevailed, and the institution of slavery was crumbling, but the victory had come too late for Isaiah. He remained a ghost at the edge of her vision, a reminder of the cost of delay. In the immediate aftermath of the occupation, Eleanor found herself in a unique position. She was a native Southerner with impeccable Unionist credentials, a bridge between the conquerors and the conquered. She assisted the Freedmen's Bureau in their efforts to establish schools and hospitals for the thousands of liberated slaves who were flooding into the city. It was during this time of chaotic reconstruction that she began to hear rumors of a group of refugees from the Combahee region, people displaced by the fighting, who were seeking shelter in the crowded camps on the outskirts of the city. The mention of her home region sent a tremor through her, reawakening the specific, personal guilt she had carried for 7 years. The chaotic environment of the refugee camps along the Savannah River presented a landscape of human misery that dwarfed anything Eleanor had witnessed during the war. Thousands of formerly enslaved people crowded into makeshift tents, their faces etched with the exhaustion of a long flight from the interior. Eleanor arrived at the perimeter of the largest camp on a damp morning in February of 1865, carrying a satchel of medical supplies and a list of names she hoped to match with the living. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and unwashed bodies, a sensory assault that contrasted sharply with the manicured streets she had just left. She moved through the rows of canvas shelters with a sense of trepidation, her eyes scanning the crowd for a face she had not seen in a decade. The refugees from the Combahee district were clustered near the western edge of the camp, identifiable by the specific dialect they spoke and the network of kinship that bound them together. Eleanor knew that her presence, a white woman in the midst of this displaced community, was an intrusion, a reminder of the power structure that had caused their displacement. She clutched her shawl tight, feeling the weight of her guilt as a physical burden. The search took 3 days. She questioned relief workers and camp elders, showing a crude sketch of the thorn plantation and asking for news of the laundry woman. Most responses were vague shrugs or fearful silences, a testament to the deep mistrust that still separated the races even in the wake of liberation. Eleanor persisted, driven by a compulsion that overrode her fear of rejection. She needed to know if Hagar had survived the fires and the famine, or if Isaiah's mother had been another casualty of the collapse of the old order. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, a young man pointed her toward a cluster of lean-tos near the riverbank. Eleanor made her way through the mud, her boots sinking into the soft earth. She found Hagar sitting on a wooden crate, stirring a pot of meager stew over a small fire. The older woman's hair was gray now, her face lined with the deep creases of hardship, but her posture remained upright, a pillar of resilience in the midst of the squalor. Hagar looked up as Eleanor approached, and the recognition in her eyes was instant and piercing. The silence that stretched between them was heavier than the humid air. Eleanor stood frozen, her rehearsed apology dissolving on her tongue. She was acutely aware of her clean dress, her well-fed frame, and the privilege that separated her from the woman who had lost a son to her carelessness. Hagar did not look away, nor did she rise. She simply held Eleanor's gaze with a steady intensity that seemed to strip away the years of war and intrigue, leaving only the raw truth of their shared history. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. She said that she knew an apology was insufficient, that no words could restore what had been taken. She told Hagar of the work she had done during the war, the documents forged, the intelligence gathered, all in an attempt to balance a ledger that could never be settled. She spoke of Isaiah, not as a memory, but as a constant presence that had guided her actions. The confession was a raw nerve, exposed, a plea for acknowledgement, if not forgiveness. Hagar listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When Eleanor finished, the older woman stirred the stew slowly, the wooden spoon scraping the bottom of the pot. She spoke in a voice that was raspy but firm. She told Eleanor that she had heard of the white woman spy in Savannah, a widow who helped the Union cause. Hagar said she had wondered if it was the same girl who had once watched her son from the study window. She acknowledged the work Eleanor had done, but she refused to grant her the absolution she sought. Hagar stated that forgiveness was not hers to give, as the debt was owed to the dead, not the living. She told Eleanor that while she could not forget the role the Thorne family played in her son's destruction, she recognized that Eleanor had chosen a harder path than most of her kind. Hagar said that Isaiah was dead and buried in the pines, but that Eleanor was the one who had to live with the ghost. It was a verdict of acknowledgement rather than mercy, a recognition of the complexity of their shared tragedy. The confrontation ended without a handshake or an embrace. Eleanor nodded, accepting the verdict, and turned to leave. She felt a strange sense of relief, as if the removal of the possibility of forgiveness allowed her to finally carry her burden without the constant struggle for redemption. She walked back through the camp, passing the rows of the displaced, seeing them not just as victims, but as survivors who possessed a moral authority that she could never attain. The fate of Cypress Knoll had been decided months before Eleanor's meeting with Hagar. In January of 1865, as General Sherman's forces moved northward, they had systematically destroyed the economic infrastructure of the Combahee region. The main house at Cypress Knoll was burned to the ground, the flames consuming the ledgers, the furniture, and the walls that had witnessed the secret meetings between Eleanor and Isaiah. The fields were flooded and the dikes broken, returning the cultivated land to the swamp from which it had been claimed. Elias and Martha Thorne had fled the advancing army, seeking refuge in the interior of the state. They died within a year of each other, the patriarch succumbing to a stroke in the summer of 1866, and Martha following him into the grave from pneumonia the next winter. Their deaths were recorded in the parish register, but there was no one to mourn them. Their daughters, scattered across the South, did not return for the funerals. The dynasty Elias had built on the labor of 64 human beings had evaporated, leaving nothing but ash and debt. The physical destruction of the plantation was absolute, but the hidden document in the study wall had survived the fire. The carpenter's workshop, built of brick and located away from the main house, had been spared the worst of the flames. The secret compartment that Isaiah had crafted remained intact, protecting the testimony that Hagar and the others had inscribed. It waited in the ruins, a silent witness awaiting discovery, while the world around it struggled to be reborn from the ashes of the Confederacy. Eleanor returned to her townhouse on Jones Street, but she did not remain there long. The house felt too large, too filled with the memories of her aunt and the suffocating atmosphere of the past. She sold the property in the spring of 1866, determined to leave the South and the constant reminders of her guilt. She packed her belongings and a small nest egg derived from the sale, heading north to Boston, a city where she could disappear into the crowd and live a life of anonymity. She was a woman without a home, a citizen of a country she had helped save but could not fully inhabit. The transition to Boston was a migration into a colder climate, both meteorologically and socially. Eleanor arrived in the late spring of 1866, finding lodging in a boarding house on the narrow streets of the North End. The city was a labyrinth of brick and cobblestone, teeming with immigrants and the bustle of post-war industry. Here, she was not the disgraced daughter of Cypress Knoll, nor the celebrated spy of Savannah. She was simply a middle-aged woman of diminished means, seeking to lose herself in the anonymity of the urban crowd. She adopted her mother's maiden name, Sinclair, effectively severing the final tie to the Thorne legacy. Her days settled into a rhythm of quiet labor. She found work as a copyist for a firm of maritime lawyers, her neat handwriting and familiarity with ledgers making her a competent, if invisible, employee. The work was tedious, but it required no emotional investment, allowing her mind to retreat into a protective numbness. She lived frugally, saving a portion of her meager wages, not for any future luxury, but to fund the small acts of charity that had become her only connection to the world. She attended a Unitarian church on Sundays, sitting in the back pew, finding solace in the sermons that spoke of a universal redemption she felt excluded from. The years began to blur, the sharp edges of her memory wearing down like stones in a river. The pain of Isaiah's death did not vanish, but it became a chronic ache rather than an acute wound. She wrote no letters to the South and received none. The silence was a deliberate choice, a wall she constructed to keep the ghosts at bay. She followed the news of Reconstruction from a distance, reading about the violence in the South and the slow, grinding failure of the government to protect the freedmen. Each report of a lynching or a burned schoolhouse felt like a personal failure, a sign that the sacrifice of the war had been in vain. In 1870, she changed her occupation, taking a position as a teacher in a charity school for the children of newly arrived Irish immigrants. The classroom was a chaotic, noisy place, filled with children who spoke in thick brogues and had little patience for the decorum Eleanor had been raised to value. Yet she found a grim satisfaction in the work. Teaching these children to read and write felt like a small defiance against the ignorance that fueled oppression. It was a way to use her privilege for something other than self-preservation. The physical toll of her earlier hardships began to manifest in her health. By 1875, Eleanor suffered from chronic respiratory ailments, a legacy of the damp winters of Boston and the years of stress. She moved to a smaller, sunnier room in a different boarding house, her world shrinking to the four walls of her living space and the walk to the schoolhouse. She was a solitary figure, respected by her employers for her diligence, but known to no one intimately. She had become the spinster she had once feared, but the fear had long since been replaced by a weary acceptance. Despite her isolation, she remained a voracious reader. She subscribed to the Atlantic Monthly and The Nation, devouring articles on the changing landscape of the country, She read the poetry of Whitman and the essays of Emerson, seeking a philosophical framework that could contain her experience. The Transcendentalists spoke of the oversoul and the interconnectedness of all beings, a concept that resonated with her own fractured sense of identity. She felt connected to Isaiah across the veil of death, a connection forged in guilt, but sustained by a strange, lingering love. It was in the pages of a discarded newspaper that she found the first piece of the puzzle she had not known she was missing. In the spring of 1878, she read a small item in the Boston Liberator regarding a recovered document from a plantation in South Carolina. The article mentioned the name Cypress Knoll and the date August 10th, 1855. Her heart seized in her chest as she read the description of the paper, the signatures, and the accusation against the planter, Elias Thorne. The secret she had carried for 23 years was suddenly public property. The discovery that the testimony had survived was a shock that disrupted the careful equilibrium of her life. She had assumed that the fire had consumed everything, that the truth had been lost along with the buildings. The realization that Hagar and the others had created a record and that the record had endured filled her with a mixture of awe and terror. The testimony was a validation of her own memory, proof that the crime had not been erased by the passage of time. It forced her to confront the reality that she could not simply disappear into the north. She sought out the full text of the article, walking to the public library to read the transcript. The names of the signatories were printed in black and white: Hagar, Josiah, Pearl. These were not just names from her past. They were the people who had witnessed her fall. Reading their testimony felt like hearing their voices in her ear, a chorus of accusation and truth. The document did not mention her by name, referring to her only as the daughter, but she felt the weight of its gaze upon her. The revelation prompted a final act of documentation. Eleanor sat at her desk in the boarding house, the gaslight flickering, and wrote a letter she knew she would never send. She addressed it to whomever finds this, and began to write her own account of the events of that summer. She wrote of her naivety, her selfishness, and the moment she understood that her love was a weapon. She described Isaiah's skill as a carpenter, and the way the light had hit the sawdust in his workshop. It was a confession, a memoir, and a tribute all in one. The letter was raw and unvarnished, lacking the polish of her usual correspondence. She wrote of the irony that she, the oppressor's daughter, had lived while he, the innocent, had died. She detailed her work as a spy, not as a boast, but as a debtor's ledger, a list of payments made against an infinite debt. She admitted that she had found no absolution, only the endurance to continue. The act of writing was an exorcism, an attempt to transfer the burden from her soul to the page. When the ink was dry, Eleanor folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. She did not seal it, nor did she leave instructions for its delivery. Instead, she placed it inside a hollowed-out copy of Leaves of Grass on her bookshelf. She knew that one day, perhaps after her death, someone would find it. The letter was her version of the hidden document in the workshop wall, a testimony left for a future she would not see. It was her final attempt to ensure that the truth, in all its complexity, was not lost. The final years of Eleanor's life were marked by a quiet dignity. She retired from teaching in 1885, her health too fragile to manage the classroom. She spent her days reading and sewing, watching the city change outside her window. She was a fixture of the neighborhood, the old Miss Sinclair, who always had a kind word for the children on the stairs. The war and the tragedy of Cypress Knoll seemed to belong to another century, a closed chapter in the history of a woman who had outlived her time. Eleanor Sinclair died in her sleep on a snowy night in January of 1893. She was 57 years old. The doctor listed the cause of death as heart failure, a diagnosis that was technically accurate, but spiritually incomplete. Her passing was noted with a brief obituary in the Boston Globe, which mentioned her work as a teacher and her long residence in the North End. There was no mention of Elias Thorne, the plantation, or the name of the carpenter who had haunted her for 38 years. She left behind no heirs, only a few pieces of furniture, a shelf of books, and an unsealed letter waiting to be read. The disposal of Eleanor's earthly effects was handled by her landlord's wife, a practical woman named Mrs. Clancy, who viewed the contents of the room with an eye toward utility rather than sentiment. The worn clothing was distributed to a local charity, and the modest furniture was sold to settle the outstanding rent. The box of books, however, proved too heavy and cumbersome for immediate removal, destined for the cellar until a junk dealer could be summoned. It was during this hasty sorting that the unsealed envelope tucked inside the copy of Leaves of Grass slipped free, fluttering to the floorboards like a dried leaf. Mrs. Clancy, possessed of the inquisitive nature common to those who manage boarding houses, did not hesitate to read the missive. She unfolded the pages, expecting a will or perhaps a list of debts, but instead found a confession that spanned decades and geographies. The contents, detailing a forbidden romance on a South Carolina plantation and a life of espionage, seemed too fantastical to be true. She dismissed the letter as the ravings of a lonely, eccentric woman, perhaps influenced by the sensational novels of the day. With a shrug, she tucked the letter back into the book and consigned the whole box to the damp cellar, unaware of the historical weight she was handling. Meanwhile, in South Carolina, the physical landscape of Cypress Knoll had undergone a transformation. The ruins of the main house had been overgrown by kudzu and wild grapevines, the brick foundations slowly dissolving into the marshy soil. In 1878, a freedman named Silas Jenkins, who had purchased a portion of the land for back taxes, was clearing the site of the old carpenter's workshop to build a new home for his growing family. He worked with a reverence for the past, salvaging the handmade bricks that had been fired by enslaved hands over half a century before. It was during the dismantling of the southern wall that Silas made the discovery that would eventually link back to Eleanor's final confession. His crowbar dislodged a loose brick, revealing a dark, hollow space behind the masonry. Inside this cavity, protected from the elements by the craftsmanship of its builder, lay the metal strongbox he had found years prior, but also a second, smaller bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Silas wiped the grime from his hands and carefully extracted the bundle, his heart beating a little faster as he unfurled the cloth to reveal the fragile paper within. The document he uncovered was the one that had been reported in the Boston Liberator years earlier, the testimony signed by Hagar, Josiah, and Pearl. Silas, who had learned to read in the schools established by the Freedmen's Bureau, scanned the faded ink. He recognized the names of the elders in his community, people who had lived and died with the weight of this secret. The text was an indictment of Elias Thorne and a defense of the carpenter named Isaiah, a man Silas remembered only as a shadow from his early childhood. The rediscovery of the document sent ripples through the small community of freedmen living along the Combahee River. It served as a tangible link to a history that was being rapidly forgotten or rewritten by the rising tide of the lost cause narrative. The paper was taken to the teacher at the local school, a man named Arthur Pendleton, who recognized its historical significance. He copied the text by hand, ensuring that even if the original disintegrated, the words would survive. The document became a treasured artifact, a proof of resistance in an era where the rights of black citizens were once again under siege. In Boston, the box of books from Eleanor's room sat in the cellar for nearly a decade, untouched and gathering mold. It was not until 1893, the year of Eleanor's death, that the landlord's grandson, a student at Harvard, descended into the cellar looking for old texts to sell to a rare book dealer. He found the copy of Leaves of Grass and opened it, discovering the letter that Mrs. Clancy had dismissed years prior. Unlike the landlady, the young man, whose name was Thomas, was struck by the specific details of the letter, the names, the dates, and the mention of the hidden document in South Carolina. Thomas, intrigued by the possibility that the ravings of the old spinster might be fact, took the letter to his history professor. The professor, a specialist in the antebellum South, examined the paper and the handwriting with a critical eye. He noted the quality of the ink and the consistency of the narrative with known historical events, such as the burning of the Combahee plantations by Union forces. The letter was cataloged and filed away in a collection of personal papers, a curiosity that awaited a researcher with the time and inclination to connect the dots. The two documents, the hidden testimony in South Carolina and the deathbed confession in Boston, existed in parallel archives for decades. They were like two halves of a broken locket, separated by 1,000 miles and the indifference of time. The story they told, of a planter's daughter and an enslaved carpenter, remained a local legend in the South Carolina Lowcountry, passed down through generations, but lacking the official validation that would make it part of the broader historical record. Hagar, the last surviving author of the hidden document, had died in 1889. She spent her final years in a small cabin on the land Silas Jenkins had purchased, a matriarch surrounded by grandchildren who listened to her stories with wide eyes. She had lived long enough to see freedom, though it was a freedom circumscribed by poverty and the resurgence of white supremacy. She never learned of the letter Eleanor had written, nor did she know that her own testimony had been preserved. Her legacy was oral, a living memory that breathed and changed with each telling. The land itself seemed to hold the memory of the tragedy. The old oaks still stood along the river, their branches draped in Spanish moss, silent witnesses to the rise and fall of Cypress Knoll. The river continued its tidal rhythm, indifferent to the human dramas that had played out on its banks. There were no monuments to Isaiah, no markers to indicate where he had lived and loved and been condemned. The erasure that Elias Thorne had sought was nearly complete, except for the fragile papers hidden in a wall and a book. It was not until 1912 that the threads of the story were finally woven together. A historian researching the role of Southern women in the abolitionist movement stumbled upon Eleanor's letter in the Boston archives. Intrigued by the reference to a hidden document, she reached out to contacts in South Carolina. Through a stroke of providential luck, she was put in touch with the descendants of Silas Jenkins, who still possessed the original testimony found in the workshop wall. The convergence of these two sources provided a rare, complete picture of the event. The historian published a paper on the Cypress Knoll incident, using the two documents to reconstruct the tragedy. The paper created a minor sensation in academic circles, offering a poignant case study of the intersection of race, gender, and power in the antebellum South. It stripped away the romanticized notions of plantation life, revealing the brutal economic calculations that lay beneath the surface. The story of Eleanor and Isaiah, once a whispered secret, was now a matter of public record, etched into the permanent ink of scholarly inquiry. The publication of the paper brought a final, if posthumous, justice to Isaiah. He was no longer merely a line in a ledger, a piece of property valued at $2,200 and then discarded. He was revealed as a skilled craftsman, a lover, and a victim of a system that weaponized intimacy. The documents forced a reckoning, however small, with the human cost of the institution. The silence that Elias Thorne had bought with $900 and a bill of sale was finally broken. The truth rising from the cellar and the wall to speak its piece. The publication of the historical paper in 1912 served as the final structural beam in the edifice of memory, bridging the gap between the illicit intimacy of the study and the clinical analysis of the archives. The academic community received the work with a quiet appreciation for its thorough sourcing, citing the convergence of the Boston Letter and the Combahee testimony as a rare instance of complete documentation. The paper stripped away the Gothic romanticism that often cloaked narratives of the antebellum South, leaving behind a stark skeleton of economic calculation and human cost. The document found by Silas Jenkins was eventually donated to the South Carolina Historical Society in Charleston, where it rests in a climate-controlled vault, cataloged as Enslaved Community Record, Colleton County, 1855. The paper is brittle to the touch. The iron gall ink faded to a rusty brown, but the X of Hagar and the careful script of Pearl remain legible under the archivist's lamps. It sits alongside the bills of sale and the plantation ledgers, a silent rebuttal to the official history recorded by men like Elias Thorne. Eleanor's letter, preserved in the Boston archives, provides the necessary counterweight to the testimony of the enslaved. While the hidden document outlines the crime, Eleanor's confession maps the internal landscape of the perpetrator. Her admission that love without power is violence has been quoted in sociological texts as a succinct summary of the dynamics of coercion under slavery. The letter transforms her from a vague historical footnote into a complex figure of complicity and attempted atonement. The physical location of Cypress Knoll has long since been reclaimed by the low-country environment. The brick foundations of the main house are now obscured by dense undergrowth, and the rice fields have returned to natural marshland, teeming with herons and alligators. There are no historical markers on the winding road that passes near the site, no signs to indicate that a tragedy of such proportions unfolded on that soil. The landscape itself seems to have conspired in the erasure, swallowing the physical evidence of the Thorne family's ambition and Isaiah's destruction. The descendants of Silas Jenkins still farm a portion of the land, holding the deed to the soil their ancestors once worked in chains. They maintain the oral history of the Cypress Knoll incident, telling the story of Hagar and Isaiah to their children as a lesson in survival and the importance of bearing witness. For them, the documents in the archives are not mere historical curiosities. They are the title deeds to a truth that was nearly stolen from them, a proof of their ancestors' humanity in the face of a system designed to deny it. The story of Eleanor and Isaiah has permeated the local folklore of the Combahee region, evolving into a legend that shifts with the telling. Some versions paint Eleanor as a tragic heroine trapped by her father's cruelty, while others depict her as a reckless woman who destroyed a good man. The details vary. Sometimes Isaiah is a field hand, sometimes a conjurer. But the core truth remains unaltered. Power without accountability breeds tragedy. These tales are told on porches at night, a cultural inheritance passed down through generations. The contrast between the official record and the popular memory highlights the mechanism of mythologization. The ledgers and tax records of Elias Thorne tell a story of wealth, expansion, and social standing. The hidden document and the oral tradition tell a story of theft, assault, and murder. The historian's achievement was in forcing these two narratives to occupy the same space, proving that the prosperity of the planter class was built on the murder of the enslaved. The legend is not a distortion of history, but a correction of it. The fate of Elias Thorne serves as a grim footnote to the morality tale. He died believing he had successfully navigated the crisis preserving the family name and eliminating the evidence of his daughter's transgression. He did not foresee that the very walls of his plantation would testify against him, nor that his daughter would dedicate her life to undermining the world he built. His legacy is one of ash and infamy, a warning against the hubris of those who believe they can own the truth. Eleanor's life, defined by a single catastrophic error, became a study in the long arc of penance. Her years of spying and teaching were not enough to wash away the stain of Isaiah's death, but they provided a structural counter-narrative to the life of leisure she was raised to expect. She died in obscurity, yet her final letter secured her a place in history not as a planter's daughter, but as a witness against the system that raised her. The central moral thesis of the story, that privilege can be a weapon even in the hands of the naive, remains relevant. The documents in the archives serve as a permanent indictment of the romanticization of the Old South. They force the reader to acknowledge that the genteel society of the plantations was maintained only through the constant threat and application of extreme violence, and that love, when crossed with such power, becomes a lever for destruction. The survival of the hidden document is a testament to the foresight of the enslaved community at Cypress Knoll. Hagar, Josiah, and Pearl understood that their lives were considered expendable, and that their masters held the power to erase their very existence from the official record. By creating and hiding their testimony, they engaged in an act of rebellion that was as profound as any escape attempt. They ensured that their truth would outlast the empire that sought to suppress it. The story of Cypress Knoll is ultimately a narrative about the endurance of truth. It demonstrates that while lies can be recorded in leather-bound ledgers and supported by the courts, the truth can be hidden in hollow walls and passed down in whispers. The silence that Hagar observed changing in the air on the night of the discovery was not an absence, but a holding of breath, waiting for the moment when the evidence could be exhaled into the world. In the end, the archives contain both the bill of sale that valued a man at $900 and the document that declared him a victim of murder. These two pieces of paper, separated by decades and miles, face each other across the aisle of history. They represent the fundamental conflict of the American story, the struggle between the legal fiction of property and the undeniable reality of human dignity. The truth, once buried in a wall, has finally emerged to claim the final word.